We are studying the book of Esther. This is our second lesson in the book of Esther. I always like to do a quick review so that those of you who were not with us the last lesson can kind of catch up to where the rest of us are. Let's start off, Bandy, go ahead and put the timeline up on the sheet, on the overhead. Okay, so before we studied Esther, we studied the book of Ezra. Okay, up here on the timeline, Ezra 1 through 6. Now, on the left is years BC. So years BC go backwards. So of course, at the time they were living, they weren't counting years backwards. But now that we know history, we count years backwards. So Ezra begins with the first group of captives coming back from Babylon to the Promised Land after 70 years of captivity. So Ezra 1 through 6, and then in the middle column is the name of the Persian kings. Persia, during that 70-year period, Persia had actually taken over the Babylonians, so the Persians were now in charge. So they were the biggest empire in the world. Cyrus was their king in Ezra chapter 1, and we studied how it had been prophesied by both Isaiah and Jeremiah even before he was born, that he would be the deliverer of the Israelites from captivity to let them go back. And so Josephus, the historian of the Jewish history, who lived in the first century, taught us that Daniel, who was an older man then, remember he was the advisor to a series of all the Babylonian kings and then the Persian kings, that he actually, in Cyrus's first year, he showed Cyrus the prophecies where it named Cyrus by name 100, 200 years before he was born that he would deliver the Israelites. And so Cyrus takes note of that and tells the Israelites, any of you that want to go back can. 50,000 men plus their families did. And so Cyrus was the king of Persia then. He had a son named Cambyses. He's not named in Ezra. He was the next king of Persia, but he only was king about 8 years because he was killed in battle. And so 539, the first group returns to Judah. 515, the temple's completed. And then that's Ezra 1 through 6. And then between Ezra 1 through 6 and Ezra 7:10 is when the events of Esther occur. And so Esther is the events that occur in Susa, the capital of Persia, and the king at that time is Xerxes. Now, if you have the NIV Bible, it'll say Xerxes in Esther verse 1, chapter 1. If you have an older version, it'll say Ahasuerus, which was the Jewish name for Xerxes. And so Xerxes he married the daughter of Cyrus the Great, so that's how he got, and he was a general in Cyrus's army, so that's how he got to become king. So he is king for about 9 years. He actually is the king that marries Esther. He carries out the second war with Greece, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And then Ezra 7 through 10, the king that is named there is Artaxerxes. He is the daughter of Xerxes and Esther. And when we studied the book of Ezra, we noticed that in Ezra chapter 7, that Ezra is going to lead another group back to Judah. And so he goes to King Artaxerxes and asks for a list of things to take back with him to Judah. And we noted how generous Artaxerxes was. I think in the last lesson I misspoke. I said it was Artaxerxes' wife that was Esther, but his mother. Anyway, so he at that time he had great mercy and grace upon Ezra, probably because his mother's influence, Esther. And so the second return was under Ezra. And then after we finish the book of Esther, we will study the book of Nehemiah, which Nehemiah brings a third group back to the Promised Land 12 years after Ezra does. Okay, so put up the map now. Okay, so this is the map of the Persian kingdom. So it's even bigger than the Babylonian kingdom was. To the left is the Mediterranean Sea, the blue part there. The left lower part is Egypt, down into Ethiopia. And then if you go to the right, the Persian kingdom extended past what is now Iraq and Iran and into what's called now India. And then the upper left is Turkey. And then if you kind of cross the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, that's the upper part of Greece. So this is by far the largest world empire that ever had been at that point in time in history. There were 127 provinces. Okay, let's see here. So you can go back to the timeline now. So Darius I, who is before this period of time, he was a king of Persia before Cyrus, who wanted to extend the Persian Empire into Europe. And so he had the first what's called Greek-Persian War. He was the king that was named in Ezra chapter 6. So we're getting late enough in history and Bible history where there's a lot of written history outside the Bible. So what we're trying to show you is we're nearing the end of Old Testament history, but we know a whole lot about what went on because of outside historians, and we can interlock that with what happened in the Bible, and it all matches perfectly. So Darius did the first war with the Greeks and lost. He only took about 28,000 men, but he lost to the Greeks. Now the Greeks were not a country, they were several city-states, but they banded together against the Persian. So when Xerxes became the king, he decided that he's going to raise this humongous, amazing army, and he's going to beat those Greeks because he wants to extend his kingdom into Europe. Anyway, so to get back to what we talked about last time, besides just this external stuff, Esther chapter 1, as it begins, Xerxes is in the third year of his reign, so Esther starts in 482. And what the events of Esther chapter 1 is Xerxes preparing for the second Greek-Persian War. So this is what he's doing. He's not just doing these things willy-nilly, he's doing it for a purpose. And so, first of all, he gives a great banquet for all the leaders of his kingdom, especially all the military leaders. And then chapter 1 talks about how for 6 months he parades his army through all these provinces, basically enlisting more and more young men to fight in the army. And we learn that his army was absolutely massive, hundreds of thousands of men, because his Darius I had lost with 26,000, so he knew a whole lot. He needed a whole lot more to beat the Greeks. And then near the end of chapter 1, he bring up the picture of the palace. It says, after this 6 months of parading the army around the provinces and building the army, then it says he gives a banquet for all the inhabitants of Susa, which is the capital. We don't know how many people that was, but it was a large city. And he brings them to his palace and the palace grounds, and this is a rendition from carvings of what his palace looked like. Now today that would be a pretty nice building, but this was built 500 years before Christ. We talked about how history talked about how it was built, and they dug out to bedrock 60 feet down and filled it with basically gravel as a foundation, because they didn't have concrete back then. And so then they used carts, ox carts, and with weights in them to press down the gravel to make it a solid foundation. Then they built this massive palace. And so he had this 7-day feast. Okay, now put the picture of the gardens back up. Okay, so this is actually we don't have a historical image of the gardens of Xerxes, but this is the gardens of his grandfather Cyrus, which was 30 miles north. So you have the palace in the middle, Anyway, the gardens were 250 acres, and they are irrigated with hewn limestone irrigation. And so throughout these gardens are cages of exotic animals. And so what the Persian kings did, they were one of the first kings in the world that would bring exotic animals from all over the kingdom and cage them and do that for entertainment of their guests. And so it was called a zoological garden, which is where the name we get zoo from. And they would also bring trees and shrubs and bushes and plants from all over the kingdom, and as you see how big the kingdom was, and plant them there and have them on display. So this was kind of a place where guests could come and just marvel at stuff they've never seen before. Animals they've never seen before, plants and trees they've never seen before. And so this is where a garden of this size is where he entertained the people of Susa for 7 days. And then at the end of chapter 1, we read where Xerxes at the end of this feast was very drunk, as were most of the men, and Vashti, the queen, had her own group of kind of leading women where she was having a banquet. And the king sends for Vashti to come and parade her beauty in front of all these drunken men, and she refuses. And that's quite an alarming thing for him to be refused by his queen on an order, because that was a very male-dominant society. And so he asked his advisors, he kind of like the president's cabinet we have today, they all had a circle of advisors. And this is how we know Daniel's dead by now, because he's not in this group that they named the 7. And by this time, Daniel has passed on. Anyway, Memucan speaks, and he says, if word gets out that the queen doesn't have to obey the king, then all the women of the whole kingdom will revolt and tell their husbands, if the queen doesn't have to obey her husband, then we don't have to obey you. And so Memucan says, Vashti has to be taken out as queen. She can never again come before the king. And so the king and all the other advisors totally agree that that's the only answer to this problem. And so he removes Vashti as queen. He sends messengers all over the kingdom, this massive kingdom, to leave messages in all the cities that Vashti is no longer queen and that every man is the master of his house. So that's kind of how chapter 1 ends. Okay, then so between chapter 1 and 2, put the map back up if you would. Between chapter 1 and 2 is when Xerxes goes to war with the Persians. So this is the second Greek-Persian war. We've mentioned that if you watch the movie The 300, where the 300 Spartans held off the Persians for many, many days, the massive army of Persians. This is when that occurred, between chapter 1 and 2 of Esther. There's a 2.5 to 3 year period between chapter 1 and 2 when Xerxes has gathered his massive army and he's gone to fight the war. And then also last time we studied that this was, besides a massive army of several 100,000, he had 1,200 ships, which he took to fight the Greeks. And so at the Battle of Salamis, Salamis, he fought the Greeks, but he actually lost that battle. And so the bottom line is that they did not get to expand their kingdom into Europe because the Greeks beat them back a second time. And if you remember from history, they were at each other for many, many different wars through the years. About 330 BC, which is 150 years after tonight's lesson, is when Alexander the Great from Greece actually finally defeated the Persians once and for all. And we studied last time how the massive wealth of Susa was just unimaginable. The historians tell us that it took Alexander the Great, he had to have 10,000 pairs of mules pulling carts and 5,000 camels to bring back the gold and silver that was in Susa when he defeated Susa. Just massive amounts. So we can see how when Ezra went to Artaxerxes in Ezra chapter 7 and asked for $270 million worth of gold and silver, He gave it to him. I mean, that was pocket change compared to the billions and billions of dollars worth of gold that they had in Susa. Okay, so as chapter 2 starts, we're getting ready to get down to new information, okay? Chapter 2, verse 1. Let's read that. So it says, after these things, is what the ESV says. The NIV there on your lesson sheet says later. So he's referring to after the Second Greek-Persian War. We're 2.5 to 3 years later, after chapter 1. He says, after these things, Xerxes' fury had subsided, and he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what he had decreed about her. So he had made a decree that could not be changed, so he could not forgive her and bring her back. So basically, Xerxes had become a king of Persia in 485. The Second Greek-Persian War was 482 to 479. So now he's back from war and he needs a queen. Okay, verse 2 to 4. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for the beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province. Remember, there's 127 provinces of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa, in other words, the capital of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's chief eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So what we know from historical accounts outside the Bible is that the Persian kings kept 2 harems. They had one harem that was young virgins that they had brought in to undergo this year of beauty treatments, and these were the before they ever went in to the king. So we had like one harem that was young ladies in preparation. So they had a year of beauty treatments and cosmetics to make them absolutely as beautiful as possible, but they'd already been chosen because of their natural beauty. And then the second harem was the concubines. So these are women that had already lain with the king, and they were also called second wives. They really had no power or no standing other than the fact that the king could call them in to spend the night with him at his disposal. So both of these harems were sequestered from society, and they both lived in lavish surroundings there in the palace area, but they were kept sequestered and away from the family of the king. So they were there simply for the pleasure of the king when he called for certain ones. Both groups were attended to by eunuchs, castrated males, so they didn't have to worry about those men getting in trouble with the ladies. And so it was customary for the Persian kings that they had the right to claim any young virgin in the kingdom to be part of his harem, and then when the virgin was brought in, they would become part of the first harem and undergo the year of beauty treatments. If you remember, Solomon kind of took up some of this. You know, David didn't do this, but Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So as a Jewish king, he kind of thought what the other guys were doing was pretty neat, even though we now know that was one of his downfalls. So the plan is here that's proposed is let's get a fresh group of young virgins that are beautiful, put them under a year of beauty treatments, and then king, you can spend the night with these different ladies and then choose a new queen. And so he thought that was a good idea. Okay, verse 5. Now there in the citadel of Susa there was a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So he was actually brought, probably as a young boy then, because this is now 70, 80 years, 90 years later. So he was probably a very, very young boy who was brought with his family when the last group of captives were taken from Judah into captivity into Babylon. and now Persia has taken over Babylon, so they've moved the capital from Babylonia 150 miles east into Susa. Babylon was in what's now Iraq. Susa is in what's now Iran, southern Iran. Anyway, so the Jew is named Mordecai, and we get a little about his family history. He's a descendant. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, and remember there was a king of Israel who was from the tribe of Benjamin, who was a son of Kish. Do you remember who he was? Saul, King Saul. So Mordecai is a descendant of King Saul. Okay? Now, remember this, because when we start talking to the next time, I want you to be here next time, chapter 3, you will learn something about Haman and Mordecai that you've never heard before. And I'll tell you that because I'd never heard it before. I've read 5 commentaries on this, and only one of them brought this out. Four of them totally missed the point. It's a very, very important point of this whole story. Anyway, so Mordecai is in Susa, and so let's learn about what he does. Verse 7. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah. So this is a young lady whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. She's an orphan. So there's some connection family-wise between he and she was left. Of course, back then, most people did not live to an old age. Even in America, the average, when Congress passed Social Security in 1935, for people to start drawing Social Security at age 65, the age 62 was added later, but age 65, the average lifespan in America in 1935 was 58 years. So Social Security was for the rare person that got to 65. So most people did not live long because of infectious disease, from cardiovascular disease, from cancer, all these things that we have treatments for now, why people are living so much longer. But you go back into the 1800s, and the lifespan in America was like 45, because so many children died of dysentery and measles and all these other infectious diseases that we have cures for now. So back then in Bible times, very few people lived to be at a ripe old age, kind of like Mordecai had. So it's not unusual that this young orphan girl would lose both of her parents. So she's an orphan, and her Jewish name is Hadassah. And so she obviously, has been born in captivity there in Susa, or maybe perhaps in Babylon before he took her to Susa. And the Bible describes her as this young woman who was known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her mother and father died. So the Bible describes her as beautiful to look at, and she had a beautiful figure. And so we hope that the cancel culture in America doesn't read this verse, or they'll want to throw Esther out of the book of Esther out of the Bible because it's sexism. But anyway, it's the truth. And so that's the writer of Esther is just saying basically why this young woman was chosen to be part of the harem. Okay, so she was born in Susa, perhaps Babylon, but we think she's born in Susa. Esther 2, 8 through 11. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So at this point in Susa, there's very significant anti-Jewish sentiment. And we're going to learn in the next chapter it's due to Haman, who was a government official, who was very anti-Jewish, and we'll study next lesson why he was anti-Jewish. So wait till next time on that one. Anyway, so when Mordecai learns that, the king has made this edict, somehow he kind of has a inkling that this cousin of his that he's raising his daughter may be taken. He says, okay, your name is no longer Hadassah because that's a Jewish name. There's a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, so we're going to call you Esther. Esther was actually a Babylonian name. And so she takes on the name of Esther, so it's not known that she's a Jewess. Jewish historians tell us that there were about 400 beautiful virgins rounded up for this queen contest. So Esther is one of these 400 beautiful virgins that are rounded up and placed in harem number 1 to undergo beautiful beauty treatments and special foods. But Esther does not mention to anybody that she is a Jew. But Mordecai, knowing about the anti-Jewish sentiment and not knowing how, I guess, if Esther was able to contain her nationality, they're sequestered, so he can't get to her, but he stays as close as he can, hoping to hear from people that maybe come and go that work in the harem, how she's doing. So he's always trying to check up on her because he just has a feeling that something may not go well. Okay, verse 12 through 14. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go into the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem. So that's the other harem, the concubine, the second part we're talking about, to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines, harem number 2. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So when the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. So it's surmised that basically these women, before they could go in to see the king, would go into the king's treasury and pick up jewels and jewelry and things to adorn themselves with to try to make themselves even more beautiful. And they got to keep what they could choose and wear for the evening. So when they went to the concubine harem, they got to keep those things for herself. But it says Esther chose nothing. She said she just asked Haggai, who she already had his favor because he apparently liked her and had favor on her, what she should take, and he kind of told her what to take, and she took nothing else that she chose herself. So again, basically she's showing great respect for authority. And it says, Esther won the favor of Haggai, and then it says in verse 15, she won the favor of everyone who saw her. And so think about the level of competition in this group of 400. You think about say a Miss America pageant. You got 50 women who are vying for this crown, and don't you know that even on the surface they're smiling and trying to get publicly get along with each other. Don't you know that there's some underhanded stuff going on? Here you are, the chance you have a 1 in 400 chance to be the queen of the world. So don't you know that there's some ambition, there's some jealousy, there's some cruelty, there's some gossip, there's some self-centeredness, some selfishness. Somebody's going to get to be the queen. I want to be the queen. But I'm convinced, from what I read here, that Esther really had none of that driving ambition. We talked about in the book of Ezra how God's hand, and Ezra mentions God's hand leading he and even the king, the pagan king. Multiple times he mentions that. And I think Mordecai had taught Esther that God's hand was on her life. And so basically if she just yielded to God, God would use her in his grand plan. And she was a child of God, and she was there for a reason. So she just really didn't have a lot of personal ambition. We mentioned last time how the name of God is not mentioned in this entire book. Prayer is not mentioned in this entire book. Faith is not mentioned in this entire book. But throughout this book, you see the hand of God just guiding everything as it happens. And we mentioned how a good word picture was, it's kind of like this book or this story of Esther is kind of like a boat. And God is the rudder. So you don't see the rudder, but the unseen rudder is guiding the boat to where the captain wants it to go. And so God's the captain, the boat is this story, and God is guiding it. So it says she asked for nothing except what Haggai told her to take. Verse 16 through 18. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any other the other women, and she won his favor. Notice it keeps saying Esther wins favor. She won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So we're in the 7th year of Xerxes' reign, and we're having the audition for the queen. So here's the question for you. If God is the rudder on this story, is Esther's chance of becoming queen really 1 in 400? Or is it really 1 in 1? You know, God's in charge here. Even in a pagan city, even with a pagan king. I put down there Proverbs 21:1. In the Lord's hand, the king's heart. And we're not necessarily talking about believing kings. Any king in the whole wide world, any dictator, any president. In the Lord's hand, the king's heart is a stream of water that he channels towards all who please him. So in the Old Testament, you have Esther, who becomes queen of the biggest kingdom in the world. You have Daniel before her, who's just passed. And it's like Daniel was also in that group that was captive. So he was an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar and all the Babylonian kings and all the kings after him, the Persian kings, until he died. And as soon as he died, here comes Esther. So what's happening here? Then you think about Joseph back in Egypt. So God is not raising up these people to be high in government for their glory. There's one reason God's doing this. God's using them, God's hand is on them to protect his people. To protect his people. God is protecting the lineage of Christ. That's what's happening. God is protecting the lineage of Christ by placing his people in places of authority in the kingdoms of the world. He's not doing this for Esther's glory. So Esther had favor with the chief eunuch Haggai. She had favor with all who saw her. And now she wins the king's favor and is made the queen. Verse 18. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. So it says a great feast. Now this is not a dinner at the Simmons Center. We kind of talked last time how Persian kings were known for their incredible feasts. They would have feasts for thousands of people that lasted days on end. They had all this wealth, and so they were showing off their wealth and showing off their kingdom, and now he's showing off his new queen, Esther, so he's going to impress people. He's not going to order in Burger King and tacos for the guest. Okay, so he has this. Now, verse 19 through 20. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So even after she becomes queen, when it'd be very possible for her to kind of get prideful because she's now the queen, she's still respectful of the authority of Mordecai and realizes that what he's taught her is true, that she needs to keep her mouth shut about being a Jew. But Mordecai is still concerned about her, so he's still sitting at the gate of the king so he can hear any news about how queen, because he can't just go in and see her. She's the queen. She's sequestered. And so he's still sitting at the gate wanting to know if she's okay, if it slipped out that she's a Jew. So verse 20 and 21 and 22, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Now, we don't know why they became angry, but they decided that Xerxes had to go. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he got the word. I'm sure it wasn't personal, but he got the word somehow to Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. So he's overhearing, so he's sitting at the gate, concerned about Esther, but while he's sitting there, these two guards of the gate are talking about their plan to assassinate the king. And so Mordecai gets the word into Esther, and she hears about it, and she tells the king. Verse 23, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So Mordecai's part in uncovering this plot to assassinate the king is recorded in the king's history book. So, like I say, the NIV here says impaled on poles. And I noticed other versions say they were hung, right? And then remember later on in the story, Haman erects these really tall gallows, and the other versions say hung. So I thought, well, let's just read about how Persians executed people. That would be a nice, pleasant thing to end the lesson on tonight. They were actually quite inventive on how they kill people. And if your stomach's not full, you might just Google Persian execution methods. But actually what they did to these two guards was actually one of the nicest things they did. What they didn't hang people from ropes. But what they did was they impaled them on, they have, big sharp poles that were very sharp, very tall, stout poles are very sharp, and they would impale the person on it. And so it's unsure whether they would impale them and then stand the stick up, or whether the large stick was already in the ground and they would walk up the stairs and just lower them onto the stick. So they died pretty quickly. But that way they could leave the body there for several days, because all of their methods of execution, some of them fast, some of them slow, were very public because they felt like that would be a deterrent to crime. When I was in Nigeria as a medical missionary, every town of any size had a public execution area. And there they did the firing squad deal. So there was poles, kind of like big around telephone poles, but they were about 12 feet tall, and they were just, you could see the poles. There were about 5 of them in each town, and there was a lot of blood around those poles. I didn't personally see an execution, but that's what they did. When they got enough people who had the death sentence, they just lined them up, and they'd call the public. They wanted people to see it as a deterrent to crime. So this is how these two guards under Xerxes were killed. They were impaled on poles. Okay, that gets us to the end of chapter 2, and we got about 15 minutes. So we're gonna watch 15 minutes of a movie on Esther. This section that we just read about, I've got the name of the movie there on your lesson sheet. It's on YouTube. It's a very, very well done movie. The name of the movie is called One Night with the King, Esther the Bible Movie. And we're going to watch 15 minutes of it, and then we'll be done.